Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. In my previous video, we have seen what are callback functions in JavaScript, why do we need them, how can they become problematic and lead to callback health. That's where I mentioned about promises. So in this video, we are going to look at what are promises, try to understand them with simple examples. We'll see what are different states of a promise object, how can you create chains of promises, and finally we'll see how we can handle error with promises. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Check out my playlist. I've got some interesting videos out there. Keep watching. So what are promises? Promises are similar to their literal meaning, which means I'm making an intention of doing certain thing after such and such event happens. Similarly, in JavaScript, when we are dealing with asynchronous functions, we need to decide what needs to be done after the response is received. It basically allows you to associate handlers with asynchronous events. That's what promise is. In my earlier video, I talked about callbacks. This is kind of something similar, but promises are a better and cleaner way of handling asynchronous responses. Let's try to understand this with simple example. Let's say I'm looking for a job and I have given interviews into one of those big tech giants, Mang, Fang, whatever. Now I promise to myself that I would give my friends a treat whenever I land up a job offer. How about that? Now I haven't yet got a job. It's just a promise which I have made to myself and it's registered in my memory. Point to note here is that my friends are not yet aware of this promise. Now let's say things go well and after some time I get a job offer, and you know promises are promises. I have to stick to them. I have to give my friends a treat. So a promise is said to be in one of these three states: pending, fulfilled, and rejected. The pending state is the initial state. In my example, this means that I have got no response from these companies. The fulfilled state meaning that the operation was completed successfully and I got a job offer. The third state is rejected, which means that the operation has failed. I have not been selected by any of these companies. So a promise can move from pending state to either fulfilled or rejected. Let us dive into some code and see how promises work. To start with, I'm going to create a promise. Now here we are going to instantiate this promise object. This is the constructor and we are going to pass in a callback function. Now there are two ways of creating a callback function. Either you can go with the regular syntax function like this, or else you can go with the arrow functions. I'm going to use the arrow functions because they are lean and it's easy to read as well. So I'll create an arrow function. Now this arrow function takes in two parameters. Now one thing to note, the whole function which we have inside a promise which we pass to the constructor, this is called as the executor function because the execution happens within this. So whether my promise will resolve or reject, the outcome of this is decided inside the executor function. So the example we have here is the interview. So let's create a variable, a flag, in order to control the conditions. If I pass in the interview or I get rejected. So let's take the happy flow. I keep selected as true. Now I need to have in conditions. If selected, I'm going to resolve this promise. Now we want to simulate this as a real world scenario. We want to have this as an async call. So let's put this inside a set timeout function. We'll keep duration as 1 second. Now again, set timeout, as you know, takes in first parameter as the callback. Here I'm going to define what I need to do after 1 second, and then I'm going to give the interval 1000 milliseconds, and that's it. Let's add a console log to know what's there inside this promise object. Time to run it. So this is the promise object. It has got the state as pending and then it has got bunch of other options as well. Now why is this pending? So like I said, this is an async function. Although these instructions are written sequentially, what is going to happen is that console log will be the first one to execute. When this command is being executed, my promise is not yet resolved because I have kept a timeout interval of 1 second. So in order to capture what happens after 1 second, I need to call then function with the promise object. So I'll type in then. Now this then function has got two parameters. The first one is the resolve handler, which is the fulfilled handler. So whenever the state is resolved or fulfilled. This handler is going to call first, and the second parameter is the reject handler. So let's just write the resolve handler. So I've got two console logs. One is outside the promise handler, the other inside it. Let's see what happens if I run it. So yes, initially the promise is in pending state, and when I evaluate or when I handle the promise response, it is fulfilled because I have resolved it. Now let's see what happens if I reject this promise. So if selected is false. Now if I run this, initially it's in pending state, and after that it says, so I'm rejecting a promise without handling it. So when you are rejecting a promise, you need to have a handler for this. So in my case, I don't have a handler for reject case. So now let's write the handler for rejected promise. Let's just run it. As you can see, the first line to execute is line 14, and after 1 second this code inside is going to be executed. Since I have put the selected flag as false, this is going to reject the promise. Now coming back to my example, I could pass this as a function, which is a cleaner way of writing. I'll create a function called resolve handler, and I'm going to pass in a console message for success. Likewise, I'm going to have a reject handler. Let's run it. Also, what you can do is you can encapsulate this whole stuff inside a function. So I can have a function called promise, and within that I'll be having my promise block, and I just need to call this function. So let's run it. So as you can see, this is a more cleaner way of writing it, putting the promise inside a function. Now this was just a very naive example with promises. You might want to do successive operations one after the other, and that's where we are going to use promise chain. So let's take a simple example. Let's say I am buying something on Amazon. So when I proceed with the payment, obviously there are certain details which needs to be entered, and the payment will be processed accordingly at the payment gateway end. Now here, let's say everything goes well and the money or the amount is deducted from the bank. In that case, my promise will be resolved and I would want to perform the next operation. So it could be placing an order with the third-party retailer, or it could be within Amazon itself. So in either case, it has to be successive. Only after the payment is complete, I would go ahead and place the order. So I'm going to create a chain with then functions. So when the money is deducted from the bank, I want to place the order. If it is rejected, I want to cancel the order. So here I've got place order handler and cancel order handlers. Let me run this. So if the transaction state is money deducted, it would go to place order and you would see order placed, or else it would go to order cancelled. So next thing I want to do is assign delivery tracking, and that's where I'll have delivery tracking handler. So now if I run it, you would see that this delivery tracking is called no matter what. And the reason is because I haven't returned any promise in either of these functions. So I need to return a promise in order for this chain to work properly. In the absence of a promise, things could go wrong. So let's just return a promise and we'll add resolve and reject callbacks. Here I'm going to resolve. So my order was placed successfully. So here I can pass in order details as well. So now if I run this, what do you think should be the output? It would be the same, because after my place order returns a resolved promise, it then goes on to delivery tracking. Now let's say if I reject this here, let's say something goes wrong with the order. So now if I run this, obviously I would see error. Why? Because I haven't handled the failed or rejected promise. So that needs to be taken care. You have to handle your failed promises. And likewise, when I'm canceling the order, I still need to return a promise. And if I run this, you would see the unhandled promise rejection, because I have rejected the promise, but I haven't caught it here. So here in my chain, I need to catch those rejected promises. I can add a reject handler, a generic reject handler here. So let's just copy this. Now if I run this, obviously because we have got the handler, we would see this message. So just remember that when you're dealing with promises and you have got a chain of this sort, so make sure to return the promises properly. So this is it. Now this is going to be executed in sequence, one after the other, and that's basically what chaining is. With promise chaining, error handling becomes easier. Let us see how we can make use of catch function in our promise chains. Now let us understand what a catch function does with this example. So let's create a promise. We'll pass in reject and resolve handlers in the arrow function. Now this is the construct of my promise. What if I throw an error here? As you can see, it says error is thrown from the async function without a catch block. Now you can add a catch block either directly here, or you can add it separately like so. Now this catch would obviously catch the error which was thrown and it would put into this variable. So let's create the variable, an arrow function, because we want to print that variable. We'll use console.error here to print. Now let's just save and run this. So as you can see, error was thrown here and I was able to catch it in my catch block. Likewise, I can reject a promise and catch it from the catch block. Let's just comment this out. Now if I run this, I will get the same result. As you can see, the same result. Now what if I resolve this promise? What do you think should be the result? It is blank because my catch block wasn't triggered at all. It only works with an exception being thrown with the throw keyword, or you can reject a promise that would also be handled by the catch block. Now let's see what happens if we apply this catch function to a chained promise. So we'll go back to our payment promise example. As you saw earlier, we have got chained promises here, one after the other, and we apply a catch block right here. Now it's kind of interesting the way catch works when you apply it to a chained promise. In this example, I've got promises chained one after the other. So if anything goes wrong in the place order function, you would expect that it should be caught by my catch block. But what happens is that the reject handler is invoked. As you can see, I've thrown error inside place order function. So if I run this, what would happen is my reject handler will be invoked. So you can see that payment complete, placing the order, and reject handler was called, not the catch block. So this is tricky. You have to remember that when you're applying catch block to a chain, it is going to be executed in the sequential manner. Now in this case, if anything goes wrong in my place order function, reject handler will be invoked. But if anything goes wrong in the delivery tracking function, that's when the catch would be invoked. So I would suggest do not complicate your promises. Keep your promises simple. Make sure to have catch block with every promise handler. I think that's the best way you can avoid a lot of issues when it comes to error handling. So that is it for now. I hope you have found this helpful. Thanks for watching.